Good morning, Corey. Good morning, Gaia. Oh, just now I thought we have one member online, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Ramin, good morning. Can I please do a sound check?
Good morning. Checking 1, 2, 3. Checking 1, 2, 3.
Great. We can see you and hear you clearly. Thank you, everyone. We have quorum, Ms. Chair. If you want to start the meeting, please let us know. Then we can start to do the broadcasting.
Certainly. Good morning. My name is Sarah Gelgor, and I'm the chair of the Compliance Audit Committee. I'm joined today by my fellow committee members, Lawrence D'Souza, who's joining me here in the room today, and Ramin Faraji, who is online. The committee administrator has confirmed that we have quorum, so I'll now call the meeting, which is meeting number 9 of the Compliance Audit Committee, to order. Welcome, everyone. I see we have some people in the room, which is great. Today's meeting is being held with committee members, city staff, and parties participating both by video conference and in person at City Hall in Committee Room 2. City Hall is open to the public, and anyone is welcome to attend the meeting at City Hall today. The public may continue to participate electronically by video conference. The meeting is also being live streamed online at www.youtube.com/Toronto City Council Live. Ask everyone for their patience with any delays or technical issues. I'd like to also ask everyone to please keep your microphones on mute unless you are speaking, and members, please ensure that your video is turned on at all times. As part of each agenda item, I will ask members to raise their hand or unmute their microphone if they wish to ask questions or to speak. When voting, members, please raise your hand in front of your camera to indicate your vote. Although we may be in different locations and meeting remotely today, the Compliance Audit Committee acknowledges the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Members, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If you have an interest, please raise your hand or unmute your microphone and let me know. And seeing none, may I have a motion from one of the members to confirm the minutes of the meeting on March 22nd, 2024? Thank you, Member D'Souza. All those in favor, raise your hand. All right, and the motion carries. I'll now outline the procedure and the format of the committee meeting. We have one item on the agenda, which is a compliance audit application. Before we consider the application, I'll outline the procedure and format for considering it. The one application to consider today is item EA 9.1, compliance audit application by, and I apologize, I should have conferred in advance, so I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the applicant's name. Nishibayashi for the election campaign finances of Parthi Kandavel. An applicant, candidate, or their agent who is registered with the clerk may speak to these items. The applicant and candidate will be given sufficient time to address the application. For each application, we'll hear from speakers in this order, starting with the applicant or their agent, and then the candidate or their agent. If you wish to speak and have not already registered your intention to do so, please email the clerk staff now at complianceaudit@toronto.ca. Speakers are asked to confine their comments to the compliance audit application item being considered. After each speaker, Compliance Audit Committee members will have an opportunity to ask questions. Members may ask questions of city officials to obtain information relating to the matter under discussion. If the committee decides it needs to meet in closed session to deliberate in private, I will move a motion to close the meeting, at which point members of the public and media will be moved into the WebEx lobby and readmitted once the committee resumes in public session. After we have completed our closed session deliberation, we'll resume in public, and the committee will make its decision at that time. So we're going to move to preliminary motions. Do we have any preliminary motions from members? All right, seeing none, let's proceed with our application. And we're going to go ahead. Are there any preliminary requests from the parties? Okay, seeing none, the applicant and the candidate will be given an opportunity to speak. They will each be given sufficient time to address the application. I would ask, however, that they confine their remarks to the compliance audit application before us. Is the applicant or their agent here today? Yes. Okay. And if you could please introduce yourself and then proceed.
Good morning. My name is Rio, last name Nishibayashi, and thank you very much for accepting my application. I guess without further ado, pardon my nervousness, but I guess I should launch into my presentation. So I have prepared some slides that I'm sharing on the screen, and I have some prepared notes that I'd like to read as well, which I hope is okay. Now to begin, good morning. Thank you to the committee for accepting my application, for allowing me to make a presentation today. I made my application as someone who has a more than passing interest in politics. I am quite civic-minded and I have been involved in many elections. Recently, my attention has been focused on municipal politics. I also come before you today as a concerned citizen, and for any system of government to function and remain effective on a long-term basis, it has to retain the trust and confidence of those governed. Transparency in the process is of paramount importance for this, in my opinion, and that forms the final reason why I made my application. As long as there are lingering questions from the process, the risk of the process being undermined remains. With my presentation, I'd like to highlight a few concerns that I have. The genesis of my concerns begins with the receipts that were submitted to the city clerk and Mr. Kandavel's financial statement. I was glad to hear that the requirement to submit receipts was being reinstated in time for the by-election. And so after the election, I made a point to visit the city clerk to view copies of the receipts. After reviewing them and trying to reconcile them to the best of my ability, a few things stood out to me. The questions that came to me after reviewing the receipts are what I am here to raise today. My hope is that through this process, they are answered. I trust this committee's judgment and to make the correct decision on whether these questions warrant a more thorough review by those better equipped than myself. And that is my introduction. Now, to begin, I'd like to make sure we're all clear on a few of the underlying numbers that surround this election campaign and this financial filing. In the 2023 Ward 20 City Council by-election, there were several defined contribution and spend limits that campaigns could not exceed. Per the Municipal Elections Act 1996, or MEA, I have listed some key ones in the slide. First is the general spending limit, which is $71,583.05. This limit is known to all the candidates running, and campaign expenses cannot exceed this limit. Second is the limit of for parties and other expressions of appreciation after Election Day, which is 10% of the general spend limit, so $7,158.31. Third, there are some expenses that are not subject to either of these two limits. For example, the cost of an audit or the cost of bank fees after voting day. And there is no limit to expenses in this category, so it is important that all expenses under this category are properly accounted so that campaigns are not circumventing the spend limit. And numbers 4, 5, and 6, I have also included the limits for contributions to the campaign, but generally speaking, the only source of contributions is from individuals living in Ontario. And the maximum contribution allowed for such an individual is, of course, $1,200. I'm sure the committee already knew that. Now, in this financial filing, Mr. Kandavel claimed a variety of expenses and income sources. I have included a screenshot of the expense summary here. The key number is $67,044.08, which is the total amount of the expenses subject to the general spend limit that is claimed. Further to the $67,044.08 claimed for expenses subject to the general spend limit, which is $4,538.97 lower than the general spend limit. Mr. Kandavel also claims $223.65 in expenses for parties and other expressions of appreciation. He also claims an additional $5,780 in expenses not subject to general spend, the general spend limit, of which $1,680.14 are claimed as fundraising expenses that do not count towards the general spend limit. And so, as mentioned, the campaign claims to be $4,538.97 under the spend limit based on claimed expenses subject to the spend limit. This is helpful context for our discussion. And so the first item I'd like to discuss is what appears to be significant discounts to the value of goods and services purchased by the campaign, specifically from Canada Post. I would like to offer an overview of the situation. According to the campaign financial filing, there were 3 separate orders made to Canada Post for the delivery of printed material in November 2023. These 3 literature orders comprised of more than 80,000 literature pieces that Canada Post was paid to distribute on behalf of the campaign, which is quite a significant quantity. Now, the campaign received a significant discount to the value of the literature distribution of 40%, meaning the campaign paid only 60% of the market value of the service. The difference between the price paid and the market price should have probably been accounted for as an in-kind contribution, though it would not have been a valid contribution because it came from a corporation and was greater than the maximum $1,200 contribution limit an individual can make. Pardon me, sorry. The far more critical consequence is that the discount should have been accounted for as an expense subject to the general spending limit, but it was not properly accounted for. The service should have been accounted for at full market value, as that is what any campaign should have had to pay for the service. By omitting the difference between the full market value and the discounted value on the invoices, the campaign received an undue advantage of thousands of dollars. The critical piece of this, with proper accounting, the campaign would have exceeded the general spend limit, which is a violation of the MEA. Now, this is clearly spelled out in the invoices submitted. Here is the first invoice made on November 17th, 2023. The invoice shows $21,369 pieces of literature, which should have cost $3,760.94 plus tax. However, a 40% discount of $1,000 $2,504.38 was applied, and tax was added afterwards, for a total paid by the campaign of $2,549.91. Similarly, a second invoice made on November 17th, 2023, shows 18,137 pieces of literature for a subtotal of $3,192.11 plus tax, but a 40% discount of $1,276.84 was applied, which after tax only costs the campaign $2,164.26. Finally, the third invoice on November 24th, 2023 shows 40,898 pieces of literature for a subtotal of $7,198.05 plus tax. However, a 40% discount of $2,879.22 was applied, which after tax comes to the campaign paying only $4,880.28. Now, with the help of this chart, looking at the sum of the three Canada Post invoices, there were 80,404 pieces of literature delivered by Canada Post on behalf of the Kandavel campaign. This is an extraordinary quantity of literature for a municipal campaign. The amount of literature paid after tax based on these invoices was only $9,594.45. However, based on the discounts applied to the value of the service, the campaign should have actually paid $15,990.75. And that cost should have been correctly accounted for in the expense subject to the general spend limit, which it was not. And finally, this amounts to $6,396.30 of the campaign expenses that the campaign chose to accept and did not correctly account for in their financial statement. As mentioned, the campaign was about $4,500 short of exceeding the spend limit, which means that if this expense was correctly accounted for, which it was not, then the campaign would have exceeded the general spend limit and violated the MEA. This should warrant a compliance audit. Now, yesterday afternoon, Mr. Kandavel's team submitted a response incorrectly claiming, and this is a quote, Canada Post provides a discounted rate for mailing election campaign materials to all individuals running for office in municipal elections. Any candidate running in the Ward 20 by-election was able to access those same mailing rates with Canada Post. As such, the market value for mailing election campaign material was discounted, was the discounted price that Mr. Kandavel and all other, or open parentheses, and all other candidates, close parentheses, paid, end quote. This is simply not true. Other candidates were not offered this rate. Other candidates did not have access to this discount, and it seems only the Kandavel campaign had access to it. The claim that all other candidates had access to this low rate is, in my opinion, not correct. To illustrate this, I would like to show you another Canada Post invoice I looked at this time for the campaign of candidate Suman Roy, who also ran in the same 2023 Ward 20 by-election. Now, if we zoom in, we can clearly see that Mr. Roy's campaign's Canada Post orders cost significantly more than those for the Kandavel campaign was making around the same time. The Roy campaign was quoted the same full rate that the Kandavel campaign was quoted, which is 17.6 cents per piece of literature. The Roy campaign did use a minor 5% small and medium business discount. However, that is significantly smaller than the 40% discount that the Kandavel campaign took advantage of. And so I am not able to speak to the Roy campaign's financial accounting, other than to point out that Canada Post did not apply the 40% discount to the campaign, nor had Canada Post offered this 40% discount to any other campaign, as the Kandavel campaign has incorrectly suggested. And they would have done for all municipal campaigns. Clearly, this is a substantial discount to the value of the campaign services that should have been accounted for in the Kandavel campaign finances. Now, Mr. Kandavel's team's claim that all campaigns had access to this discount appears to be false. I assert that this was not available for all campaigns, and that it represents a substantial advantage of $6,396.30 in campaign expenses, and that the Kandavel campaign chose to accept and did not correctly account for this in their financial statement. If properly accounted for, this would push the Kandavel campaign in excess of the general spend limit and in violation of the MEA. And clarifying this matter may warrant a compliance audit, or so I hope. Next, I would like to discuss what seems to be the campaign's improper classification of campaign event expenses as fundraising and event expenses. And so, as mentioned, the MEA distinguishes between different types of campaign expenses, in particular, campaign expenses, fundraising expenses, and other administrative expenses. Now, Mr. Kandavel claimed to have two fundraising events that simply didn't show any funds raised. And we are asking, how are those fundraising events if they did not raise any funds? Now, under the MEA, fundraising cannot be incidental, and it cannot be a convenient cloak for ordinary campaign spending subject to the general spend limit. And so it would have to be explicitly advertised as. Now, one of those is a campaign office opening fundraising, or so it has been labeled, and it was the first of two fundraisers that reported no raised funds. Now, perhaps these events failed, or were they actually intended for an alternative purpose? Now, despite multiple advertisements and posts promoting the event, none of the promotional materials for the office opening event included any reference to the event as a fundraiser, as you can see from these examples that I have clipped. And so it is a violation of the MEA to classify a regular campaign event as a fundraiser in the financial statement, even if some funds are raised, because it cannot be incidental to the event. Now, it seems to me that the Kandavel campaign was aware of this misclassification of a campaign event as a fundraiser, because in the response submitted yesterday, they now refer to this event as a campaign office launch and fundraiser. However, during the campaign, this was exclusively marketed as a campaign event, not as a fundraising event, and advertised widely as a campaign launch and office opening. There is no mention of fundraising in any event advertising. There is no expectation communicated that the primary purpose of the event is fundraising. Any fundraising at that event was incidental to the nature of the event, therefore, and this seems to be an attempt at improperly classifying a campaign expense as a fundraising expense to avoid exceeding the general spend limit. There was another campaign event that Mr. Kandavel claimed as a fundraiser on the financial statement, and, let's see, and despite expenses of over $1,500, again, there was zero revenue reported. Now, if the same misclassification of campaign expenses as fundraising expenses is occurring here, there would be nearly $2,000 being claimed in the financial statement as fundraising expenses when they should have been general expenses subject to the spending limit, which, as discussed, the Kandavel campaign was fairly close to exceeding. Now, Now we can go to the next slide. Another area that I wanted to touch on is receipts and expenses that are missing from what was submitted to the city clerk. Oops. All right, it's a little bit quick. Now, per the City of Toronto's election bylaws and the Municipal Election Act, there are a variety of requirements for disclosure of campaign expenses. Candidates are additionally expected to follow these requirements to participate in the city's rebate program, or they are ineligible to participate in the city's rebate program. These numbers I had These numbers I had previously shared at the rounded off difference between what was claimed out of the financial filings compared to what could be determined from all of the receipts that had been previously submitted. There were thousands of dollars in claimed expenses that did not have any supporting receipts submitted to the city clerk as obliged by the campaign. The lack of those receipts meant it was impossible for the public to have transparency into the campaign finances, which is the purpose of the requirement to submit receipts. Now, a more detailed analysis of the limited receipts submitted showed that there were more than $10,000 in expenses that had no documentation submitted. And so with those limited receipts that were submitted, I was able to identify areas of spending where receipts were missing. By aggregating all the receipt costs and categorizing them, I arrived at the totals you see in the tables here. However, fewer receipts were submitted than adding up to the total spending in several areas, totaling over $10,000 in spending with missing receipts. For example, one area where no receipts had been submitted to the city clerk was advertising costs. Now, according to the financial statement, $3,338.08 was spent on advertising. The campaign purchased several ads in local newspapers, as well as printing ad campaigns, or running ad campaigns, on Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram to the rest of us, in addition to perhaps other types of advertising. Meta does provide some transparency tools that disclose how much advertisers spend, which indicates that spending on that platform could have been as high as $2,283. The newspaper ads probably cost hundreds of dollars on top of that. I appreciate that the receipts were finally produced by the campaign less than 24 hours ago in Mr. Kandavel's response yesterday. However, the fact that none were submitted to the city clerk on the original timeline highlights the need for a compliance audit to ensure that there are no other expenses that are unaccounted for. As another example, Mr. Kandavel appeared to have contracted services from the Daisy Group, which is a PR firm. However, no invoices were submitted to the city clerk for these services. This was another clear example of expenses that the campaign was not being transparent on. Now, yesterday, a contract was finally included in the candidate's response. However, this continues a pattern of invoices not being submitted to the city clerk as a campaign is obliged to do, and a lack of transparency that a compliance audit would resolve. Now, even though the campaign has claimed as of yesterday afternoon that all the receipts have been submitted, there are discrepancies that immediately pop up with the latest submission of documents. For example, the contract shared yesterday on July 2nd for Daisy Group services suggests $2,000 plus HST was owed, while the only payment the campaign issued was $2,000 even. So that's a gap of around $260 that should have been accounted to the general spend limit. And so how many discrepancies exist? Do they add up to the violations of the MEA? Again, only an audit can confirm that. Because these documents were not released until yesterday afternoon, the only way to get an answer from these new inconsistent documents is by proceeding with a compliance audit, in my opinion. Another, albeit minor, expense that appears to be missing is printer paper in both receipts submitted by the city clerk and the response submitted yesterday afternoon by Mr. Kandavel. There were receipts submitted for printer ink, but I haven't found a single receipt for paper. And we all know campaigns run on paper. This was also not listed amongst the missing receipts identified by the campaign in the response sent yesterday. The campaign has claimed that 99% of all expenses and receipts were submitted, but the absence of any paper is a simple but clear example that there are campaign expenses for which receipts have not been submitted or perhaps not accounted for in the financial statement. This again points to the need for a compliance audit, in my opinion. Now, additionally, I was able to obtain an earlier version of an invoice submitted by Mr. Kandavel's campaign manager, whose name is also Parthi, incidentally. The key differences between the two versions are that the version submitted to the city clerk was modified to reduce the total invoice total by $400 from $5,720 to $5,320. Possibly to reduce pressure on campaign expenses subject to the general spend limit, and to also specifically put $1,600 of the spending after election day, and therefore outside of the spending limit. A compliance audit would help answer the questions on this discrepancy. Finally, I wanted to just touch on various unattributed flyers that were distributed during the campaign targeting other candidates in this by-election. Per Section 88.3 of the Municipal Elections Act, an election campaign advertisement purchased by or under the direction of a candidate shall identify the candidate. As we will see, flyers that were distributed during this campaign do not meet this requirement. At the end of the campaign, tens of thousands of unattributed flyers were distributed across the board targeting candidates Suman Roy and Kevin Rupsing. There was also evidence that individuals were being paid in cash to do so. This print flyer was produced and distributed widely, targeting the candidate Suman Roy, and it quotes an article which came out late in the Trillium, I believe. And so there are also two distinct versions of a so-called Brisky Rupasing flyer. One version is on the left showing front and back. The other version is on the right and has some slightly different text. Now, there is reason to believe that these were produced by Mr. Kandavel's campaign beyond the inherent benefit he received from them as a candidate. Roy and Rupasing were considered his main contenders, after all. An invoice was submitted by Mr. Kandavel for a rush print job at the end of the campaign for S flyers and K flyers, perhaps referring to Suman flyers and Kevin flyers. I also found this invoice peculiar as the other print invoices submitted by his campaign, such as the example on my next slide, were very specific in describing which flyer it was for, but the S flyers and K flyers seemed deliberately vague, or vague at the least, and a compliance audit would help to get to the bottom of this. Now, as you see, this invoice identifies the size and nature of the flyers that were printed. whereas the previous one I showed does not. It appears to be vague to obfuscate the nature of the S flyers and K flyers. These flyers would constitute an MEA violation, and a compliance audit would clear the air on this matter. In summary, it is clear to me that a compliance audit is warranted, and based on the evidence available in Mr. Kandavel's financial statements and receipts, the discrepancies that exist in these documents, the questions that arise upon inspection, and the lack of transparency that the campaign has shown. As I first mentioned, the campaign has inaccurately accounted for the value of goods and services with their campaign expenses, particularly with Canada Post, which suggested that $6,396.30 was unaccounted for. And with proper accounting, this would have pushed Mr. Kandavel's campaign in excess of the spend limit, which is a violation of the MEA and requires a compliance audit. As also discussed, the campaign has misclassified campaign expenses as fundraising expenses, which, if correctly accounted for, would mean that the campaign has further violated the MEA by overspending. A compliance audit is needed to properly account for misclassified fundraising expenses. The lack of transparency related to thousands of dollars in missing receipts that the campaign was obliged to provide, as well as obvious discrepancies even in the updated set of receipts submitted yesterday, and the evidence that invoices may have been altered by the campaign, all lead to the conclusion that a compliance audit is necessary. And finally, the source of the unattributed campaign literature, of which the anonymity is in itself a violation of the MEA, and that the money that was spent on its production. And as well, the distribution of said remains unclear. A compliance audit is the only mechanism to determine whether the literature was produced and distributed by this campaign, or it truly was not, to otherwise determine the true source of the significant unaccounted for finances invested into this literature, and to maintain the integrity of our municipal elections, to maintain the confidence of the public in the accountability process, and to eliminate any doubt in any of these topics. I feel it is incumbent on this committee to proceed with a compliance audit. Thank you very much for taking the time to review my application, and once again, have a nice morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd particularly like to thank you for your very thorough and detailed assessment and your presentation walking the Compliance Audit Committee through the various points. I'm going to turn it over to my fellow panelists. I do have one question, and then I imagine that they will have questions for you as well. I have a question relating to the points that you made with regard to the Canada Post, perceived discount. And you were good enough to share sort of a different candidate's statement. But you also zeroed in on the volume, and I think you indicated that it was over 80,000 pieces. 80,404 pieces had been mailed with those Canada Post invoices. And then when you reflected on a different candidate's discount, it was much lower volume. Did you have an opportunity to check with Canada Post? Was this a volume discount? Did it depend on how many pieces were being mailed?
I was not able to do that. However, if I remember correctly, the response from Mr. Kandavel's campaign yesterday specifically mentioned that it was a campaign-related discount, and they describe it as such.
Okay.
But they also said, and in their response, all campaigns were able to access it, which does not mention anything about volumes, so Suman Roy's campaign did not get it, which does not exactly match what they say. And an audit, I think, would be the best way of determining whether this is the case or not.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to provide my fellow panelists or members an opportunity. Do Ramin or Lawrence, who wishes to go? Okay. Member D'Souza?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions for you. Those anonymous negative ads, why do you think this candidate was behind them? There are 23 other candidates, plus there was a registered third-party advertiser. Have you analyzed their expenses?
So in that by-election, although there were a large number of candidates, many did not have the, how should I say, the organizational might or as large of a campaign to be able to do the required fundraising, to be able to do the required research, to be able to do the distribution as thoroughly as these flyers were distributed. My request for an audit is not dependent entirely on these unattributed flyers, but I think it's a valid question to ask, if only to clear candidate Kandavel or Mr. Kandavel. So as you saw from, say, Suman Roy's Canada Post invoice, he was one of the other campaigns that did go that route, but did not actually distribute that much flyers and had different, I should say, points that did not match any of the language on the unattributed flyers. And so there is some conjecture from others that there is one candidate whose some of the languages does match up with the unattributed flyers. But that, whatever the end result of that, I think it would be better for the audit committee to review and to clear the air. And if it is not candidate Kandavel, then it would clear his name, and that would be great for everyone and restore faith in our municipal politics, I believe.
Thank you. Have you worked as a volunteer or otherwise for any candidates during the by-election?
Any candidate?
Any candidates during the last by-election?
During that one?
Yeah.
Yes, I have.
You did?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Member Faraji, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a question, and I admit that I may have missed it just because of the connectivity issue for a moment. I think I believe I heard you say that there are evidence of other cash payments or cash expenses. But then again, it may have cut out and I haven't heard the subsequent part. Could you just elaborate on that a little further, please?
Sorry, for which expense or?
Did I hear correctly that you said there are some evidence of cash expenses or cash transaction outside of the financial statement submitted? Did I understand that correctly?
If it is in relation to the unattributed flyers, there have been people that were asked while they were distributing those flyers, and they said that they were paid in cash to distribute those flyers. Who paid them? We have no information on that.
Okay, so it still is related to those flyers that are. Okay, I understand. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the members? No. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. And at this time, if the candidate or his representative wishes to come forward, or both.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With the committee's
believe what we would intend to do, I'm sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Paul Eric Veal. I'm legal counsel to Mr. Kandavel. Our intention is, if it's agreeable to the committee, Mr. Kandavel will make a short statement in the order of a minute to a minute and a half, and then I'll deal with some of the granularity going through that, if that's agreeable.
Okay, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, committee members. It's a little different to be on this side. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Parthi Kandavel, and prior to being elected city councillor, I taught grade 6 for 12 years. And I also had the privilege of representing my ward at the Toronto District School Board for 8 years as the TDSB trustee just prior. And in my 4 elections, I've never had a compliance audit put forth on me, or at least a charge. So I just want to give that context, and I'm fully supportive of answering all questions and providing information to help the committee make its decision. Very quickly, you know, it was interesting to see that presentation, what was submitted last Friday. The clerk's office has 99.3% of all the receipts, expenses, invoices. We submitted them all in March at the deadline. The 0.7 were around $500 of food expenses. As you can imagine, an intense election, small receipts. They're mostly pizza joints, 2 restaurants, and a Tim Hortons run. So that can easily be verified. And I want to, you know, make clear the Canada Post discounts were available to all candidates. There was some volume, of course, involved, but I was available for all, and that would, by virtue of this, you know, the MEA would implicate the Crown Corporation for breaking MEA laws. So I just want to make that note. With the Wine Academy allegation, as part of, you know, if you plan your kid's birthday party to hall, there's some negotiation. We didn't have the need for wait staff. They waived that. So that, I think, is part of any booking of a venue. The kitchen staff brought the food right to the table, so we didn't need the wait staff. We had no role involvement at all in these unattributed campaign flyers that were referenced at the end of the presentation. In fact, we were, as you may have seen in my submission, attacked as well as part of a campaign. We're not sure who, and we're not going to, you know, accuse folks of that, but that I think perhaps is important to note as well, as you can see in the attachment. And looking forward to focusing my energies towards serving our city and constituents, as opposed to be distracted by a protracted potential audit. So I just wanted to share those opening remarks.
Thank you. Council?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, committee members. As I said, I'm Paul Eric Veal. I'm counsel to Mr. Kandavel. I've had in the past the pleasure of appearing at Compliance Audit Committee proceedings on the other side, acting for applicants in these matters. I think it's a sign that I'm getting older, that my friends are now elected to office instead of banging at the doors, but it's a pleasure to be here before each of you today. I'll try to keep my remarks focused, and I just want to address in turn the various allegations that Mr. Nishibayashi took you through. At the outset, you are all experienced committee members, so I won't walk you through the legal test, but you understand there's the preliminary question of the reasonable grounds to believe that there's been a contravention of the Act, and there's a standard that requires not speculation, not suspicion, not conjecture, but some evidence. And second, there's the second element, which is that there is some discretion vested in the committee to decide whether it's in the public interest to order a compliance audit. And my submission is that in this case, no compliance audit should be ordered. Let me deal first with the Canada Post allegation, which is a different kind of allegation, and let me level set as to why it's a different kind of allegation. If Mr. Nishibayashi's allegation is correct, that the discounts that Canada Post provided should have been included as contributions and expenses, then I agree. If that were the case, then Mr. Kandavel would be over the election campaign limit of roughly $71,500. So I want to deal with those separately. With respect to all of the other allegations that Mr. Nishibayashi made, the roughly $1,650 in fundraising expenses, there was an issue about, I think, printer paper that was raised. If you add up all of those other expenses, I say he's wrong about those, and I'll walk you through those. But even if you add up all of the other expenses other than the Canada Post piece, Mr. Kandavel is still well under the $71,500 general spending limit. And so we're not in a situation where there would be an overspend. There would be, even if Mr. Nishibayashi is right, there would be accounting errors made along the way, but there would not be any unfairness substantively. We would not be over the limit. Canada Post is different, and let me deal with that, because it is the case that if those expenditures were included as contributions and expenditures, there would be a problem for Mr. Kandavel's campaign. And as we said in our submissions, there would be a problem not just for Mr. Kandavel's campaign, but for the campaigns of many city councillors, not just in the 2022 election cycle, but going back further than that. So let's speak about the Canada Post discount. Canada Post makes available discounts to all candidates running for office at the municipal, the provincial, and the federal levels. Any candidate for any of those offices can set up an account with Canada Post, and provided they hit a certain volume discount, they are entitled to access those discounts. This is by no means unique to Mr. Kandavel. This is any candidate who hits those volume levels can take advantage of that discount. There was no particular discount provided to Mr. Kandavel. It was a discount available to all candidates. The question under the Act isn't whether there was some discount provided. If I purport to sell you a banana for $15, but tell you I'm going to give you a $14 discount so that I'm only selling you a banana for $1, there's no contribution, there's no $15 expense. The question under the Act is whether what has been paid for the goods and services are market value. In this case, Mr. Kandavel and his campaign paid the market value for mailing Canada Post flyers, because that's the price that Canada Post charged for that volume, and there's nothing wrong with a volume discount. Buy one, get one pizza free is a volume discount, and I don't think there's any suggestion that Mr. Kandavel or any other candidate couldn't call up Pizza and obtain that discount available to the general public. And so I say it must be the case that that type of discount that is available to all candidates is acceptable. If it were otherwise, Canada Post would be a contributor under the Act, and as a corporation, it's not permitted to be a contributor. It would be committing an offense under the Municipal Elections Act, and any candidate availing themselves of that discount would also be making offenses under the Act. And so I say Mr. Nishibayashi's submission on this point is simply incorrect. Let me move on then to the other categories. And as I say, with the Wine Academy and the office fundraiser and the additional amounts in respect of the Wine Academy fundraiser, and as I say, the key thing with these, and I'll walk through the substance, but the key thing about these is that even if Mr. Nishibayashi were right in his allegations, we're looking at an increase in the order of a little over $2,000 of additional expenses. There is approximately $4,500 left in the expenses subject to limit, and so there is no overspend. But getting into the substance of it, let me deal first with the legal framework on that. Fundraising expenses have been a vexing problem under the Act for a long time. And that arises in part because the Act contains some ambiguity as to what constitutes a fundraising expense. It's a fundraising function under the Act isn't defined, except the Act says in the negative, events or activities that are organized for such purposes as promoting public awareness of a candidate and at which the soliciting of contributions is incidental is not a fundraising event. So we know that if fundraising is only incidental to the purpose of an event, it's not a fundraising function. Otherwise, the Act provides discretion to candidates to categorize things as a fundraising function if there's a bona fide fundraising purpose to that. The Wine Academy fundraiser, which I'll parenthetically note is the vast majority of the fundraising expenses of the ballpark $1,650 of fundraising expenses. Over 1,500 of those were in respect of the Wine Academy fundraiser. Only $130 were in respect of the office launch-in fundraiser, and so that's a very minor piece of the story here. The Wine Academy fundraiser was a fundraising event that 20 people, give or take, attended. This was not a mass event at which individuals broadly were invited to attend. I don't think I received a fundraising email. I was very hurt by that. The invitation to that event, and I won't force you to pull it up, but we have a brief that we provided of documents that I hope you've been able to access. If not, we'll make sure you get it. Tab 5 of that brief is the Wine Academy email that went out to potential attendees. It starts with, "We kindly invite you to a campaign fundraiser for Parthi Kandavel for City Council taking place on October 11th at the Wine Academy from 6 to 8 p.m. It's a small event described as a fundraiser. I don't know how it could be seen as a general campaign information event. It was clearly simply a fundraiser. The response, as I understand it, that Mr. Nishibayashi makes is, well, it couldn't have been a fundraiser because if you look at Schedule 2 to Mr. Kandavel's financial statement, there was no revenue raised at that fundraiser. And I think this may simply reflect an ambiguity in how the form is set up. There was revenue raised at each of the fundraisers, at both the Wine Academy event and the office launch and fundraiser. All of the contributions from individual donors exceeding $100 are listed in Part 3 to Schedule 1 of Mr. Kandavel's financial statement. They are not specifically listed also on Schedule 2 of the financial statement, because when you look at that form, Mr. Kandavel and his campaign team didn't understand that you were supposed to itemize individual contributions at that fundraiser on that part of that form. If you have, and just to show you what I mean by that, if you have the letter that we submitted yesterday handy, Schedule 2 of the financial statement describes what must be listed on that form. Ticket revenue must be listed. There were no tickets. This was a fundraiser where individuals were encouraged to donate particular amounts. Then there's other revenue deemed a contribution, provide details, e.g. revenue from goods sold in excess of fair market value. That refers to, you raffle off a day at the spa for $500. It's really only worth $100. There was nothing like that in any of the campaign events. Other revenue not deemed a contribution, provide details, e.g. contributions of $25 or less, goods or services sold for less than $25 or less. Again, nothing fell into that into that description. So there was money raised at each of those fundraisers. There were contributions made in excess of $100 by numerous people at each of those fundraisers, and those individuals can easily be identified. We did that in order to come up with the totals of the total amount of money raised at each of those events. What wasn't clear to Mr. Kandavel and his campaign is that anything on Schedule 2 required the description of individual contributors associated with that event. Just to be clear, what we're talking about here is only Schedule 2. All of the contributors are listed in Part 1 with the names and the dates and the amounts, and it's very easy to see the dates on which individuals donated, which can then be cross-referenced to particular events. The only thing we're talking about here is that they were not listed in Schedule 2, where incidentally, I don't think there isn't a spot to itemize them, and it doesn't suggest that one ought to have itemized them. And so that's all we're talking about here. There's no question that each of these events raised significant funds and were intended to be fundraisers. I've spoken about the Wine Academy fundraiser, and the office campaign launch and fundraiser. This does fall into a slightly different category, and this falls into the judgment zone that the challenging judgment zones that the Act requires candidates to make about whether particular events are fundraisers. From Mr. Kandavel's perspective and from his campaign team's perspective, a key purpose of the office launch event was to be a fundraiser. We've included in the brief of materials at tab 6, there's an email, office launch and fundraiser email, which both invites people to attend his campaign office launch, but also describes the need for money. It says also, I have something awkward. Our campaign needs money. Since we don't take money from developers, we rely on residents, friends, and supporters to pay for campaign flyers, signs, Canada Post, office rent, etc. That was a primary purpose of that event, and in fact, it was successful in that regard. Ultimately, many thousands of dollars were raised from people who attended that event on that day. It functioned as a fundraiser. Fundraising was not merely incidental to the balance of the event, which is the test for the exclusion of an event from a particular fundraiser. And so my submission is there's no reasonable basis to believe that there was a contravention of the Act. But again, if we're in the scenario where, let's say you disagree with me on that, let's say you say, well, I don't know about that, it seems like the campaign office launch really wasn't a fundraiser and was a general campaign event, the expenses incurred, and there's no dispute about this, for that event are $133.40. Those amounts were disclosed. Even if you took those amounts and added them to the general expenses subject to limit, we would be well underneath the limit. Why does that matter? Number one, it shows that it's a de minimis expense. Number two, it also shows that there was plainly no intention deliberately to recategorize the office launch and fundraiser as a fundraising event, because the expenses were only $133. It didn't make any difference. If we were right on the line, it would be a different thing. If there were $10,000 of expenses, that would be a different thing. That's not the case. We're dealing with a de minimis amount. Even if Mr. Nishibayashi is right in this, it would have been an innocent error by the campaign for a de minimis amount. The Wine Academy fundraiser is subject to a different allegation by Mr. Nishibayashi, and that's that there was a discount provided by the Wine Academy that went into the expenses. Mr. Nishibayashi, as with the Canada Post allegation, says some of those discounts ought to have been included as both a contribution and an expense. And on that, again, as we've said in our submissions, the point there is that in the booking of any venue, there are negotiations, and those negotiations will depend on the circumstances of the event. There is essentially no venue that one walks into and just pays the posted price. The posted price for these circumstances isn't market value. Mr. Kandavel's campaign negotiated. They had a small event. They were not using the entirety of the Wine Academy venue. They negotiated that certain fees that would ordinarily be chargeable, for example, for wait staff, were waived by the venue. That was a standard part of the negotiation. There was no discount provided by the venue that brought the value of the venue below market value, which again is the question. Is there evidence that Mr. Kandavel paid less than market value for using the Wine Academy space? My submission is there is not. Finally, missing receipts. Let me first deal with this. The set of receipts that was included in tab, I'm sorry, let me just make sure that I have this accurate. The set of receipts Of course, I now can't pull up the particular tab. Let me say it this way. The set of receipts included in the brief of materials that we filed was the same set of receipts that Mr. Kandavel went and personally handed to the city clerk's office when he filed his financial statement and all of his receipts. I don't know why Mr. Nishibayashi says that there were new receipts delivered yesterday. I don't know whether it's a matter of an error on his part in reviewing it. I don't know if something got lost in the city clerk's office. I'm not impugning anyone for that, but the reality is that when we assembled that list of receipts that is in the PDF before you, we went into the set of materials that were used to assemble the bundles to the city clerk's office submitted in March of this year, assembled all of those into a single PDF and provided those. And so I don't know why there's a difference, candidly, but ultimately the receipts are all there, barring roughly $500 in receipts. Mr. Kandavel has always been transparent about this. From the date he filed the receipts with the city clerk, there were $500, I believe, and 69 cents of receipts that Mr. Kandavel's campaign simply lost. All of these receipts were for food items, pizza, Thai food, Tim Hortons, for campaign workers. There were many receipts for food submitted. Those receipts were lost. That is what it is. Campaign offices are busy places. Directions are given by campaign managers and the candidates as to the maintenance of receipts. 99% of the receipts were maintained. Those ones were lost. Mr. Kandavel, when he went to file those receipts, told the city clerk's office that certain receipts were lost. There was no attempt to hide anything. The understanding that he had back from the city clerk's office is this happens, it's unfortunate, but no big deal. Ultimately, all of those expenses were paid from the campaign bank account that Mr. Kandavel opened. So it's not as though there isn't transparency with respect to those expenses. They are accounted for. They are contained in the candidate's campaign bank account statements. It's merely that they were not, they could not be provided to the city clerk at that point in time. I say on that issue, there's no value to a compliance audit. I would note a few things that came up for the first time on this issue in the presentation today. First off, there was a reference to the applicant having accessed the campaign's Google Drive account to access a prior version of the receipt. I don't quite know how the applicant would have obtained access to the campaign's Google Drive account. That's a little concerning to hear, that that's an internal drive used by the campaign, but let's park that off to the side. What is pointed, the suggestion then made by the applicant is that there was a change to an invoice specifically for Mr. Kandavel's campaign manager. Let's just be clear, the invoice submitted to the city clerk's office and the invoice contained in the brief that we provided, those were the same invoice. It's not as though there's a change in the invoice at this point in time. What there was a change in an original draft invoice that the campaign manager provided to Mr. Kandavel, which was subsequently replaced with another invoice to the order of a few $100s. It's a fairly minor change. There was simply a change in the amount invoiced on that. There's nothing wrong with the parties saying, oh, you've over-invoiced for a particular amount. Can you reissue a corrected invoice? That happens all the time. And of course, remember, if there was a reduction in the amount invoiced for the provision of services such that there was, for example, some volunteer service provided by the campaign manager, that's expressly provided for under the Act, and provisions of volunteer services don't count as contributions or expenses under the Act. And so there's no issue with any of that, candidly. Finally, the additional campaign literature. This one's difficult to respond to because there isn't any substantive allegation for me to latch onto. Mr. Kandavel wasn't behind those attack ads. There was nothing, as Mr. Nishibayashi acknowledges, connecting Mr. Kandavel's campaign to those attack ads in particular. Mr. Kandavel himself was the subject of various attack ads. Mr. Kandavel can't tell you who was responsible for those attack ads. He doesn't know. It wasn't his campaign. He doesn't have much of an ability to respond to it beyond saying it wasn't him and noting that the applicant hasn't provided reasonable grounds for believing that it was him. Subject to any questions you might have or anything that I've missed, Madam Chair, committee members, those are the submissions on behalf of Mr. Kandavel.
Thank you both for your submissions, very thorough. I do have a question for Mr. Kandavel and a question for Mr. Beal. So my first question, Mr. Kandavel, you indicate that this is your fourth campaign. Of the 3 prior campaigns, were any for office of city councillor?
Yes. Yes, so I contested in the general election of 2022.
Okay, so you would have completed the required financial statements, including the form that was the subject of discussion earlier with regard to fundraising?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you. And for Mr. Beal, you suggested that all of the invoices that are included in the materials that you provided late yesterday, when the receipts were submitted to the City of Toronto, they were submitted in a PDF format, and what you have provided to respond to the application is identical to what was submitted.
So I want to be very clear about this, just so there's no confusion. So substantively, they were identical. I can't speak to exactly the form in which they were submitted, but what there is I was provided access to the aforementioned Google Drive we spoke about that had all of the expense receipts contained on it that the campaign had incurred. I was told by Mr. Kandavel, and I think he can back me up on this, the submission that Mr. Kandavel made when he went to the city clerk's office was taking all of those receipts, I believe printing them out and handing them into the city clerk's office. Yep. I did the same thing, except I consolidated them into a single PDF for ease of reference. So it's not, I'm sorry, I'll let the candidate confirm what happened in March.
Yes, no, just one small addition. The full set of receipts for every invoice expense was submitted in mid-March with Toronto elections, minus the Tim Hortons, the 4 Pizza, the Thai restaurant, and another restaurant, which totaled $500. Those are the only missing receipts. Everything, I'm unsure why, in the late last week submission by the applicant didn't scan all of the receipts, but 99.3% of our expenses are with Toronto elections.
Okay. And in Mr. Nishibayashi's submission, he had indicated before the itemization that we saw this morning, there are roughly $8,000 worth of receipts that were not in the file, everything from advertising signs, bank charges. And so what you're suggesting is that all of those receipts had been submitted.
Exactly. For example, he indicates that we didn't produce our office lease or our rent. The lease agreements in there with Toronto elections, our signs, our printing, every expense in our financial statement, the physical copy is with Toronto elections that was submitted in mid-March, minus the 500.
And not to play whack-a-mole and chime in on this, but one of the examples that Mr. Nishibayashi provided was advertisements paid for on Meta. He said that in the original filings, there were no, although there were advertising revenues, expenses accounted for on the financial statement, there were no receipts for Meta ads provided. Contained in the brief we provided at pages 129 and 130 of the PDF are those very invoices for Meta. Those were submitted previously to the City of Toronto at the time back in March. Again, don't know why they weren't seen by Mr. Nishibayashi, but those were contained in the bundle of receipts submitted previously, and they're contained in the bundle you have before you in the brief.
Thank you. At this time, I'm going to provide my colleagues an opportunity to address any questions. Member D'Souza?
I have a question for the candidate. Who prepared your financial statements, your staff or the auditor?
The auditor.
Auditor?
Yeah, Krishan Sundarlingam. Yeah.
Yeah. And you filed your financial statements during the grace period, paying a late fee of $500. What caused the delay?
You know, the benefit of being elected in a general election is all, you know, elected councillors have a month off to get ready for the next term. By coming in at November 30th, I was sworn in December 7th, thrown into my first city council meeting the week after. And, you know, going from being a grade 6 teacher and a school trustee where you have no staff and scaling up, learning the scope, breadth, and depth of city council was very intense. You know, you may recall the city was going through a very contentious budget deliberations, and January, February were, you know, I was focused on my work, and that precipitated the need for an additional grace period of 30 days to get everything ready.
Member Faraji, do you have any questions?
No, thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the time to you.
All right. Thank you very much, both. All right, so at this time, I would like a motion from one of our members to go into a closed session. Member Faraji, thank you. And all those in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. I will ask the clerk to temporarily close the meeting to members of the public and to only provide access to members and appropriate staff for the closed session portion of this meeting. In addition, the YouTube live stream will be suspended until the closed session is over. Members, I'd also remind you, for those who are online, to arrange your surroundings so that no other person observes any part of the closed session debate. It's up to you now.
This is Lynn, the host. The meeting.
All right, I'd like to thank everybody for your patience and welcome back. We have completed our closed session deliberations. At this time, I will ask the clerk to please display the decision on the screen, and I will just highlight key elements of the decision. I won't read through it. It will be posted. So the Compliance Audit Committee rejected the application for a compliance audit of the election campaign finances of Parthi Kandavel. And then if I could ask that we scroll down a few paragraphs, if we could keep, okay, where are we? Well, if we can scroll up a little bit, sorry, I'm just gonna read from a few. Okay, so the committee made the following determinations in relation to each allegation made by the applicant. The committee does not support the applicant's submission that Canada Post provided an undue or unfair advantage to the respondent as compared to other similarly situated candidates. The committee is satisfied that the evidence provided by the respondent that the two events were promoted to respective attendees and held as fundraising events and should not be subject to a campaign expense limit. The committee is satisfied that the respondent did not receive discounts related to the fundraiser that should have been recorded as a contribution and expense in the financial statement. The committee is satisfied with the explanation provided by the respondent that apart from some missing receipts, which were acknowledged by the respondent, substantially all supporting receipts were submitted at the time of filing the financial statement, and additionally, filing expense receipts with the clerk's office is not a requirement of the Municipal Elections Act. Further, there is insufficient evidence that the candidate was responsible for the additional unattributed literature and distribution campaign literature. And then if we could just scroll down to the very end, please. Thank you. And just, we do wish to highlight that it is important to emphasize all candidates do have a responsibility to familiarize themselves, to understand and to comply with the rules with regard to the completion of financial statements. So we are, so at this point, I'm going to ask for my colleagues on the Compliance Audit Committee for bringing this forward as a motion. All those in favor? All right, the motion carries. That concludes our business for today. Thank you again.